All right, welcome, welcome. We have more people joining us. So go ahead and check out the chat. Say hello to one another. Hello to Charlie and I.
Hi, welcome.
I think we're going to have a pretty big group today, which is exciting. And I think there's people from all over the world, which is really fun.
I'll turn my headset, my video off here in a second. One of the questions before we get started, Shannon, is make sure you spend a little time on your background. Somebody says they know me, which is probably why they're here, because I'm not presenting. But they want to know a little bit more about you. So you might as well start there, and I will turn myself off and let you fire away.
Yeah, sounds good. Design thinking is actually something that's really personal to me because it's been a kind of a pivotal method in my life, which actually brought me to startups and to being an investor. So a bit of this presentation is actually what inputs really informed my practice and what methods I use with startups all the time. And now that we're starting to work with companies, we're really understanding how design thinking for about 15 years. And that began when I was actually working at the Department of Veterans Affairs. I had the opportunity to work for general counsel, and I was preparing for law school, and I was incredibly passionate about intellectual property. And so when I was working for general counsel, my job was part of my job was to discern whether we were going to license a patent. This patent was from the M.G. Taylor Corporation, and it included three elements. It was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright and an organizational behaviorist got married, and they decided that incredible amount of learning and change could occur in these environments that had furniture that were full of whiteboards and that were flexible to group process, incredible amounts of group process and design pattern language, and then technology, which is really where I learned that I'm a tech nerd and I love tech. And it came from me being preparing for IP law. And so what we found was that this patent, it was incredibly rigid, and it included 14 and 16 and 14-hour days, which really didn't fit with our corporate, our behavior or our labor laws, because we're a federal government and we couldn't work those 15 and 14-hour days. And so it just didn't fit our culture. And so then my job was now to not necessarily decide about a patent, but really find other methods that we could utilize. We ended up buying the furniture, which you see an example there. And if you've ever visited me at Launch House or been to Launch House, you have seen this furniture. I brought it with me when I started working with them. And so we had to fill our toolbox with other methods. And so I started to look out at what was out there in the world. And I came across some really beautiful methods and really interesting groups of people. So the first was IDEO. And if you've been in the design thinking space, or if you learn about product history or product development, IDEO is at the top of the class. When I learned some of their methods, it was actually called the deep dive. It was back like in 2004. And this was before Deloitte purchased the deep dive process. But what it did was train people to be social anthropologists and to look at work with new eyes. And so you would observe people in their natural habitat, you would observe their behavior, you would talk to them, and then you would bring all that information back and synthesize it as a group and try to make decisions on what next step you would create and what kind of prototypes. And so the prototyping process was just beautiful. And so this was really sort of my first foray into design thinking, and I fell in love. I became an incredible fan of IDEO until this day. I still leverage them as a lot of resources and sort of thinking. The next group that I spent a great amount of time with and understanding process was the Grove. So I'm sure if you've been to a meeting or sort of a fancy kind of gathering, you might see someone doing something called group facilitation or graphic recording, and that's along the bottom. It's to be a mirror of what you're hearing in the room. So I spent a good amount of time with the Grove, and they're in Palo Alto. But what I also loved about their methods is that if you're not necessarily a drawer or if you're not like keen on sketching, they have these amazing templates where you could use them with a group to get everybody on the same page. Visually, it helped everyone become very clear about what their meanings are and what their intentions are. And then you're be able to quickly move on to the next steps. So I really leverage that as part of my practice. And then closer to home, I fell into a collaboration with LUMA Institute. They have a sister organization called Maya, which is a design firm, and LUMA teaches the process that they use. And it's design thinking, and they use looking, understanding, and making. And when I started to meet with them, they were really early in their process to create these methods and cards, and they're located in Pittsburgh, by the way. And so it was really just a reminder of that, the fact that the design thinking methods, there's so many out there, and everybody sort of has their own brand. They use their own sort of pattern language. But as you're building a toolbox as a practitioner, you kind of find what works for your culture, what works for your organization, and what works for the kind of the pace of work that you do, or in industry that you're in. And you have to sort of build a toolbox that's more meaningful to you. And so I started to do that at the VA and put this beautiful, unique toolbox together. And I had a lot of interest from folks that I was working with. So I decided to leave the government, a very beautiful job in intellectual property and becoming an attorney. And I started a firm called Innovatory. And we were a strategy and innovation firm. And very quickly, we brought in new customers. I was able to turn my past employer into my customer, which was a really beautiful thing for me. And I was working, bringing them together in sort of these sessions, and I wanted a place locally to do that work. And that's how I found Launch House. I actually went to Launch House as a customer because I needed a co-working space. I decided that I would want to build a beautiful environment to bring my customers to. And that began my foray into startups, because I started working next to companies who had no budget, but they were, it was interesting work, and they were asking me questions, and I started collaborating, started writing grants, and figured out I was pretty good at writing grants. And, $10 million later, here we are. But what was beautiful was that the same methods that I was using with these large organizations, it happened at a faster pace with no budget. It was raw, but it was really that transcendence of methodology that made me fall in love with what design thinking is. Because no matter who you are, no matter what kind of company you work in, there's something for you there. And so that's for me what design thinking means. And so what is it? It's, at the end of the day, it's a collaborative method, and your goal is to understand and to create solutions. It's not linear. And so a lot of times you're going to see that kind of cyclic approach that will kind of circle back on things, and it's iterative. So it happens over and over again. In fact, I was kind of talking to Charlie that we actually don't say design thinking a whole lot at Flashstarts. It's actually become more of a way we work together rather than a method that we use. And so at some point in time, it just becomes transparent, and it just kind of morphs into how you do things. And again, you're always building this toolbox as a practitioner, what works for you. So today we're going to kind of go through what that looks like. But in a nutshell, this is my favorite visual of what design thinking can do. So if those city planners had watched the people walk, and if they would have watched where they came from and where they're going, perhaps they would have laid that concrete a little bit differently. So in a nutshell, that's what design thinking does. And there are 5 elements. You've probably used them in your work in some capacity. We're going to have empathy and understanding for people. We're going to help to define those problems and look at opportunities. You're going to visualize and generate ideas. You'll develop prototypes. And then we're going to get testing. So it's kind of like the scientific method in some ways. And there's lots of different frameworks, and all of them in some ways have value and merit. I love they're obviously very beautiful sort of visually, but then they all sort of hit home an element. And so I would say check out all the design thinking frameworks as you're informing your practice and as you're developing as a design thinker. I'm sure you're going to come across some of these, and you'll pick from ones that you like and leave others that you don't. For me, I really love the Stanford D School.
Hey, Shannon.
Yeah, go ahead.
Shannon, can you go back to that last slide and spend just a little bit of a synopsis on each one of these different frameworks?
Yeah,
because I know we're going to dive into the D School one, but I at least am interested in seriously getting a little bit of color on the other ones.
Yeah, and I think color is the kind of key point. So some of these are just visual, where they use icons, but empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test are sort of the main elements of all of them. for me, the one that really stands out is the one that looks like an infinity, because that really actually hits home what design thinking is. You can do this as long as you want forever. It'll go on forever if you allow it to, because it's part of the process of iteration. I think the other one that is really different is the gray and red one, and that really shows the divergent and convergent paths. In fact, I think there's one more element to that, but all of them I think are similar. It's just what fits with how you're describing it to your organization, whether it's a short process, whether it's part of your culture, like how are you introducing it to your organization. That's the visual I would choose to sort of lay that groundwork. If it's something that's working, you're going to be working on a big project and you're going to be focusing on perhaps empathy for a really long time, I would choose maybe the graphic up top to the left, because you can focus on those kind of key color blocks. If you're making it a more synchronous process where people should flow in and out of prototyping and testing, or you're starting somewhere in the middle, one of the circle graphics would be great. So it just depends on what your culture is too, right? So if sometimes your culture is a little bit more traditional, I'd probably choose less bright colors and something that looks a little bit more qualitative, perhaps.
Right.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of change there, but for me, the Stanford D-School process, and by the way, go to the Stanford D-School site. They have incredible resources. A lot of them are free and are kind of for download, so check it out. But for me, this process, why I love it is it really shows the divergent, convergent thinking. So when we need to like open up the realm of possibility, we're thinking big, we're really brainstorming, we're putting it out there. And then when we need to start defining and coming down to the few ideas that work. And so I really love that sort of strong reinforcement of that idea. And so during this webinar, we're going to hit up all of those elements. And my goal for today is that you walk away with at least one method that you might want to try out with your team. We're going to have a bunch of downloadable resources at the end here that Charlie will put into the chat. So you'll be able to find them. And we love resources that are free, or that you can very quickly try a pilot of it, because that's how you really get to test things out and kind of get your hands into it.
Before you dive into this, I have not me. One of the attendees has a question about the lean startup methodology that I know both you and I practice intensively with all of our startups. Where does that fit in the overall process?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when I was creating this presentation, I really started to think about my practice coming from a design thinking background and moving into startups and the lean startup methodology. And so if you're familiar with the term customer development is in every way a discovery method or an empathy method, where you're getting out of the room, you're trying to go and talk to customers or people in your value chain, or partners, or users, and really understanding what makes their pain point happen and how you can solve it. And so I think the difference in design thinking versus customer development or lean startup is the intention that starts the process off. So for a startup that's using that process, it's the founder's assumption about what works or what the pain is. And the goal is to very quickly validate that that is the case. In design thinking, it's not the founder's perspective, because perhaps there is no founder. It's actually the user needs that is driving the process, or a challenge that you're having that's driving the process. And so it comes from a very different place. But in some ways, it's a lot similar. Where it also kind of goes off is that the fact that you're thinking about building a business, a holistic business. So you're thinking about cost and revenue, and that stuff isn't necessarily in design thinking, but you can add it to it, because again, you would create an idea of what the price is, you would prototype how to charge for it, you would test out the method. So you can loosely apply this method to almost anything.
That's the other thing I would add, is that contrasting design thinking with lean startup, the prototype box is bigger. I mean, that's the more the focus on the lean startup is iterating through multiple prototypes. So it's less, not exclusively, but slightly less focused on the left side of this and more on the right side, between prototype, test, iterate, prototype, test, iterate. So it's a little more focused on the right half of this diagram.
Yeah. And if you're actually interested in delving a little deeper, Brad Feld had an incredible blog post about what the differences between design thinking and customer development is. And so he had an incredible model. So definitely check that out. But it was something I actually thought about, like how has my practice changed since I've been working with startups, and what does that mean? So it was a great question. All right. All right, so we're going to motor through this. We're going to start with empathy. And empathy, very, everybody knows what it is to kind of be more empathetic towards other people. And I would say the goals are to find what the needs are. And sometimes those are overt, sometimes they're latent. But the real challenge is identifying these gaps. And what a gap is between what somebody says or what a culture and an organization says that they do and what is actually being done. And that's where the gaps are that can either be a challenge or an opportunity to change or to grow or to provide a solution. And so back in the day, when I was working with social anthropologists, they would call this cognitive dissonance. And where are these moments of dissonance that we're looking at? Because that's where we want to focus. That's where it becomes interesting. And so when we're out doing that work, there's like 3 ways that we primarily do it. And we're either interviewing folks, we're observing their behavior, or we're trying to immerse ourselves into their process. And so a lot of creative and marketing agencies, they do this naturally. I think sometimes it's very scary as an organization to say, kind of admit, I don't know everything and I need to ask questions. And so I think culturally, especially when I was working in the government, that didn't really work out so well. And so we had to find ways to call it other things. So we would call it like, hey, we're going to walk in your moccasins. We're going to do a day in the life of a patient. And when we started contextualizing it in these different languages, it was okay to not have all the answers. It was okay to kind of do this discovery. And so we do open-ended questions, and we want to make sure that like it's non-binary. I know everyone has felt like they've done a survey before, but if you do go to that Stanford D-School resource kit, there's an amazing piece on creating an interview protocol because you'd be amazed. Like sometimes we create biased questions. We don't know it. We ask for binary questions, yes or no. Those don't work because that doesn't give us any information. We want to create open-ended questions. We don't want to lead. We also want to ask them about their experience, because if you're asking somebody about what their experience is versus having them answer a question, they're going to open up a little bit more. They might give you information that you actually didn't even know you wanted. And that's what we're looking for when we're doing the kind of empathy process. We want to understand the nitty-gritty of the details of what their life is like and where they're getting information and how they're thinking or processing something. So we always sort of end up doing a survey in some capacity. That purple one is actually Google Forms, which for me is one of, at Flashstarts, it's one of our kind of key tools that we always use. SurveyMonkey is another one that's inexpensive. And so we usually use that as our first process. And then we end up taking that data and we build an empathy map. So in a recent kind of example, we've been working with a team who's actually going through this discovery process. And so we've had to really kind of talk about how to create 3 different protocols, because when we're asking questions, we're writing for an audience. And so our physician questionnaire is very different than our patient or our insurers. We're always thinking about infrastructure, about how do we collect this data, whether it's done through phone or a person that will allow us to gain access, because access is key. But at the end of the day, we're formatting this so that it's good data in, good data out. We can make good decisions based off of it. So our survey is sort of our first part of how we kick things off. And then we're mapping out the sort of what we hear, what the patient is saying. Or, I'm sorry, in this instance, it's a patient, but it's getting into the head of the user. And this is a resource by David Gray from his book, Game Storming. It's available for download, which is really lovely. But it really helps you. The more complex of a concept that you're trying to tackle, the more useful that these are. Sometimes it's an easy thing and you kind of like say anecdotally, yeah, we know it all, it happens. You might not want to use this tool for that. It's the things that you have a lot of missing information, that maybe there's a lot of presumptions, or the access to this group of individuals or businesses is very hard. So you need to kind of chip away at it. And so that's when I start to pull out the empathy map, because it's a tool that I kind of build as we build the repository of the solution. Could we go back to the empathy map and say, hey, did we do this, and this in the solution? And we might have hit all of them, but we might have left a few out. And so that's room for improvement. But it's that checks and balances of did we do and didn't we take care of what the user needs. So I really love this resource. Okay, so now we have empathy for our user. and we've cast that broad net. Now we need to sort of take it to it. We're going to be converging and defining. And what that means is just narrowing the process. At the end of the day, the goal of the defining mode is to really focus on a problem statement or a series of problem statements, or to come to what we're going to be working on. Because now we've understood the environment, perhaps we need to dig a little bit more to be able to define that meaningfully. But we're going to have the few ideas to walk away with, so that we walk into the next stage with the few good ideas that are going to work. And these strategies are really broad. We do everything from a stakeholder map to a space saturated group affinity, which is really just dumping in the information and then trying to make sense of it or group like things together. We really build personas during this stage. So we might have an idea of who our user is, but it's about a deeper dive into who they are, where, what the household income is, how old are they, where do they get information from, what's the education level, what are they reading or being influenced by, and we're really able to create a robust persona of the user that we're trying to design for. We also use the value proposition canvas, which is actually very close to the business model canvas, but it really focuses on those needs of the user and then the value that is provided. And then I also love cover story, which is essentially, if you're writing for success, what does that sound like? Or I use something called the history of the future, which is actually today. And so if you were writing the history of the future, what does that cover story sound like? What were they writing about for you? And what does that sound like? Because you're going to come to that one specific problem statement, or one specific thing you're going to focus on if you do that and everybody agrees. So for the stakeholder map, it's about who's in the value chain, and who comes before you, who comes after you, who's part of the process, even just from a support perspective, who are partners, who are potential competitors, and then who is in the system kind of tangentially impacting, because there's a lot of influencers in the system. So the more we understand our stakeholder group, the more we're able to say, this is the moment where the cognitive dissonance or where the gap is. This is where everybody's not talking about because it's either too difficult or there's too much confusion or ambiguity. And this is where we need to solve for. And then I think the other thing is when we have to sketch it out like this, and this is kind of a rough sketch. I was actually working with a group the other day that, I wrote something out like this, and I had 2 or 3 people say, no, that's not how it occurs at all. That's not how I see it. And so very quickly we were able to come to a conversation of like, okay, that's really interesting. You're coming at it from a finance perspective. I never saw it like that. So I always thought the process occurred this way. And so very quickly you're able to tackle these complex issues from a flow. And you can use icons from clip art. It doesn't need to be drawn out, but that flow of information, who talks to who, where does money flow, information flow. You can always add complexity, layers of complexity to the stakeholder map as you confirm it as a group. So it's a really beautiful group process. And then our value proposition canvas. So we focus on the right-hand side where that iconic head is, and we're understanding and getting into the headspace of our user, what their gains and pains are, what they're currently using. And then on the left, we're focused on what the solution looks like and what we're doing to create those gains, what products and services we're using, and how we're relieving their pain. And it's that checks and balances process to make sure that the solution actually does what it needs to do and provides value to the user or the customer. And this is actually a strategizer map. It's free download, which is beautiful. So you can check it out. And then I think the other thing that we're kind of challenged with is all of these maps are beautiful. And a lot of times you see a bunch of sticky notes when you're working with a group. But now that we're all on kind of homestay and stay-at-home measures are in place, we need to find different ways of working. And so I really have enjoyed kind of looking and kind of testing out these different tools. And so Mural, Miro, and Stormboard have actually risen to the top for me as some great tools. And all 3 of them have resources, either free resources for small teams or free resources for a period of time. So I would say definitely check it out. You can create the background as any kind of template. And a lot of these have these design thinking templates that are part of the system, especially in Mural. And then you add sticky notes and you can collaborate with the team. So I would say definitely check those out as you're thinking how to integrate innovative practices into your organization. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for a second because we're sort of halfway done, to see if anybody has any questions, or Charlie, if I should dig deeper into anything.
No, so far no one's really asked any more questions. I think you're doing a great job. I'm interested, so if nothing else,
Nailed it.
I mean, I love this stuff. I think it's just fascinating, and I think the only point I would add at this juncture is what I learned in following along with you in the process of writing this webinar was how dogmatic many of the schools of thought were. So if you go back to those earlier slides, I mean, don't go, but I think it's really interesting that so many of the proponents of a particular methodology are rigid, and that just strikes me as horribly wrong, because each tool has a place and they're all valuable, but to limit your toolbox to a hammer just is a stupid thing. So I think one of the best things that you do, and I've learned to do, is to pick and choose the tool for whatever the challenge you face. So that's the only thing I'd like to add at this point. Oh, I do have a couple questions. Yes, the slide deck will be available. And here's a question. How do you form the list of stakeholders, and where do you stop? So I
Yeah.
think you talked a little bit about how do you form it, but where do you know when to stop?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. So for really complex systems, I mean, I've built in the past stakeholder maps that are entire wall, because it's a very complex system. Like at our time at the VA, we touched almost every government agency, every type of healthcare system. We had patients from all over the country as well as the world, as people come out of combat zones. So it can be a pretty intense thing. So to start off, I always kind of ask myself, like, who has to do something before I get it? And then once I do something, who do I give it to? Or who's in my value chain? So that really helps to kind of define that first layer of stakeholders. As you're thinking about sort of audiences and sort of lighter things, they might not be a customer, but they're sort of part of your influence group. I really start to map those along the outside. There is no right answer to when you stop. You stop when it stops being valuable to your business or to the solution. But I think it's always helpful to have this sort of master stakeholder group, because when you bring a new employee on, or when something changes, you got to kind of go back to that and say, hey, there was a regulatory change that happened. It's not necessarily the case anymore. We don't even have to apply through the federal government for this kind of qualification. We need to take it out of our stakeholder process. And how has that changed? And so I like to have that sort of broader perspective, but at the end of the day, if I can't make a solution that includes that, if it's not part of the solution, it doesn't impact the solution, it's just a kind of part of the ecosystem.
Thanks.
So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
All right. So now we're on to ideate. And ideate, it means exactly what it says. It's about kind of laying that broad perspective, and trying to come up with as many ideas as possible, because that serves as your fuel for prototyping. And so we kind of want to shoot for the stars when we ideate. But then the second part of the process for ideation is to then cut down to the best and most innovative and most practical ideas. So almost every ideation process since the beginning of time, I'm pretty sure, started with a brainstorm. Or if you're going to get fancy, you're going to call it a brain dump. But that means just kind of laying it all out there. Usually like sticky notes are a big part of this process. But I really like to try to push us to like double that. And so I've used a method called S.C.A.M.P.E.R, which we'll dig into. We also use worst possible ideas as the contra to some of the solutions we're coming up. So we have a challenge, are now brainstorming these solutions, and now I'm pushing myself to think, what's the worst idea? And then how can we negate that? What would allow us? Because that's kind of mitigating risk. So thinking about the risk within these solutions helps you to kind of push yourself a little bit further. Looking at analogies and what other kinds of companies are doing. It might be in a different industry, but pushing that same notion to your company or your industry, what would it look like? And so we really want to generate a large number of ideas, because from that, we have to start coming to the few ideas that we're going to pull forward. And that's R.I.C.E SCORE, bullseye, and 2x2 matrix, which we'll go over. So it's a kind of a two-part process. So actually, if I would change the visual, I would actually put a little dip in there. So it would, we would ideate and then we would refine a little bit and then we would open back up to prototype. So, but I appreciate the Stanford D School version. So for S.C.A.M.P.E.R, once we brainstorm, we get all of our ideas out there, and then the S.C.A.M.P.E.R method, there's really no kind of intellectual property other than visuals here. But as long as you know what the acronym stands for, you can push this brainstorm. And my goal for this process is always to try to double the number of ideas we have. And we do that by taking an idea and we substitute an element or variable. We combine two ideas and see if it's a stronger idea. We adapt it. We try to magnify one element over another. We put it to other uses. And so can we take something we've already done and apply it to some element that we've never even touched before? Can we eliminate a variable or rearrange? And so this just helps you, kind of gives you that kind of, mental mapping on how to change an idea. So I really love it. And I've used it with a lot of groups, which is fun. And it's a really collaborative method too. So once we have that, now we have all this beautiful data. We need to take it down. So the bullseye diagram or mandala is used a lot of times for priority. The things in the center are the things that are important. The things on the outside of the rings are a little bit less important, so that you know what you need to start with. And that's really kind of a simple process. For people who like a little bit more quantitative impact into how they're making, rather than anecdotal decisions, but more quantitative decisions, we love the R.I.C.E score, which is reach, impact, and confidence over effort. And there's a beautiful way to calculate it, talking about how many people are impacted, how much will they be impacted, how confident am I in those numbers, and then what kind of effort will it take to make that happen? And so you can really measure almost anything onto the R.I.C.E score, and it allows you to just have a little bit more substantiation to why you're making that decision of what to choose over another. And then again, our startup matrix, we always call the 2x2 matrix. A lot of times in the startup, everything to the right is beautiful, and that's where all the companies end up. But we a lot of times use it for impact and effort. You can put anything on the XY variable, but it just helps you take a lot of data and make sense of it, especially when it's feeling complex. Map it out and create 3 or 4 2x2 matrices with different things, different variables on the axis, and understand how the data really sorts out. If there's stuff that always ends up in the right corner, that comes first. So it's just, making good sense of data is important before we spend money. And I think that's something that Charlie and I, as our design thinking practice changed with startups, we learn the importance of time and money. So these processes really allow you to make good decisions before you make investments. All right, now we're on to prototyping. So we have empathy, we've defined our product process, we know what we're going to work on, we've ideated ideas, and now we've picked a few of them that are great, and now we're going to prototype. And so prototyping is exactly what it means. It means physical stuff. It can mean experiential stuff. It's digital. A prototype is really a low cost thing, whether it's an idea or physical thing, that allows you to get feedback. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is that a lot of companies are service companies, and they say, well, I don't know what a prototype looks like for us. And so for me, it's, what is the earliest, least expensive, scaled down thing that we can test so that we can get feedback. And so sometimes that looks like works like, and I'll give you an example. An insurance company wants to sort of change their method. And so what they produce is a work like, think like. They would say, we're going to produce a program. Here is what the marketing would look like. And here is how it would work. People would enter the system, they would log in, they would connect with a representative, and then it would become a human process. And that person would role play what the onboarding would look like, maybe what the service would, how the service model would change. And eventually they create a pilot program to support a few individuals, and they see how it works and they test it. It's not a technology. It's not necessarily a physical product. It's just a way of working. So I think that we need to kind of change the word prototype to mean a test rather than a physical thing. But if we are building something physical, we're looking at potential low fidelity prototypes, which is like a storyboard. Before I have money, I have a story. Before I can raise money, I have a story of how something works. I create a paper prototype rather than working in an app. And I'm showing somebody how they would go through the app, because that takes, paper and pen, and I don't have to have any money or any kind of skill as a developer to produce that, but I get my idea across around where the value would be. And then our goal is to increasingly move to a high fidelity prototype where it closely resembles the solution. And whether that means pulling a pilot program into a full program or a paper app into an app in the iPhone store, we're moving to a higher fidelity test where we're getting more information. And so the goal of prototyping is testing. We test and we prototype. It actually goes hand in hand. And I think that's, you can't have one without the other. The whole point of a prototype is to test and to make a better solution and make it better. And as you test, the test will improve the prototype. The prototype will become more complex, and then you're going to need a more complex test. So you might start with paper and pen, and then you might need to move to where the hot spots are, how people are using things, and what they're having challenges with. And so whether you're building a process, a non-tangible service, or you're building a paper product or an app, one of the methods that I really love is actually called a Think Aloud. And Charlie, you chime in. Charlie has a different name for Think Aloud. What do you call it?
So it's either stream of consciousness or run at the mouth, where you get people just to talk continuously while they're testing something. Shannon, I do have a question,
Yep.
But we're down to about 6.5 minutes, so I will. I still want to ask it because I think it's a really challenging question. So, when you're prototyping, there's scenarios in which the prototype is low risk versus high risk. Like, if it's in a hospital, then lives depended on it, or it's a space shuttle. How do you do prototyping in a high risk environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think a lot of times, like the cultures of high risk environments don't necessarily do us any help there. I can talk about like sort of an example. So I was working at the VA, and we were looking at changing care models. So we were working at creating a multifaceted. So we had a physician, we had the kind of physician's referrals, we had a care team that included, the scheduler, the nurse, the MA, if there was one. And so because we felt like we were on or we're under a microscope, how do you change a care model and test that care model with real patients so that you get good feedback? And the way that we sort of did it was we found a location that was just up and running, actually. And so there was a little bit more fluid in terms of expectation. And then we picked a few patients who were a little bit more friendly, I can say. They weren't the difficult patients that we've had with, difficulty scheduling. They were, had a care team that they were comfortable with. They knew that it was going to change, and we have formed expectation. I think that, research anything with regarding like any kind of product in a healthcare environment or ICU, research is going to be the key to that. I mean, there's going to be so many layers of validation, but when you add the human element, it's to look for friendlies and to set expectation that it's for improvement, patient satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and kind of creating a bubble around it as much as possible.
The other thing that comes into reducing risk when you're doing prototypes is the concept of role playing, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So I won't explain it anymore. But that is a useful technique when you have higher risk prototyping.
Yeah. Creating a bubble or creating an environment. We almost had to create an environment where we said this is a test environment, just like we would test any kind of procedure or IRB study or human study. We need to kind of put the same rigor of thought around how we're changing our process or including new technologies. So unless that sort of context setting was done, it would have been almost impossible, because people would have seen slight mishaps as failures, and failure is bad. And, but we created an environment where this was the case, and we needed to test and work it out because it was going to be launched throughout the country. And so I hope that helps a little bit. All right. So Charlie's reminding me that we've got 3 minutes left. Okay, so we have our Think Aloud, and just if you haven't heard of a Think Aloud, I mean, it's if you have another person that hasn't been part of the design process, you can do a think aloud, which is really cool. So in these pictures, and the best way to describe it is a picture, we see a guy with a bunch of Post-its in front of him. What he's looking at is actually a tablet for a clinical tablet for a patient login process. And so the people on the right side of the table are actually asking him and prompting him to think aloud. And so what that usually sounds like is you were saying, sir, you need to talk to us what you're doing. Okay, I'm looking at the login and I don't see it. Okay, no, there it is. It's on the right. And it's blue and I think it's usually kind of red and it should be brighter or a bigger button because I couldn't see it. Okay, now I'm in where I log in. I don't know what my password is. Okay, I see there's create a profile. And so you kind of have to prompt people as they go through the process. If they're being quiet, they're not thinking aloud. They're just thinking. So you have to say, tell me what you're thinking. And if there's quiet, tell me what you're thinking. And so you can really get some beautiful nuggets around usability, how people use something in terms of like what they're not seeing, what they're confused by, what they're frustrated by. And the closer you can get the prototype to real thing in their hand, you're going to get a wealth of information and stuff that you never even knew you needed to know. So I really just love the Think Aloud process. All right. So our final part is iterate, and I shouldn't say final because it starts all over again depending on where you need it to, whether you need to kind of go back and understand something that you didn't catch about the user story or the user need, or you're creating more prototypes. So this is an iterative approach. It's really beautiful. It kind of fits with agile methods and the way we're moving and creating products now. But I think it kind of fits for any kind of culture. You might not use it as is. So you might just pull little elements and adapt it to meet your needs or your team or the way your team talks, your organization talks. But I think all practices can be improved by some design thinking because we get out of our bodies and we get to understand people a little bit better. We get to think about designs from a different perspective. And I think perspective is really helpful. Okay, so Charlie, you want to head on back? We'll close down.
Sure. I mean, that was really great. And I think the evidence that was really great, Shannon, was that I think only one person left after you got started. So either we had them all locked down at home. Oh, wait, we did. But anyway, only one person left. I have a list of design thinking resources, which you should see on the right-hand side below the chat box. On the right-hand side of your screen below the chat box is a file that has some of the resources that Shannon mentioned and links in there.
Yeah, I think as our time is in startups, we've realized the importance of free or very inexpensive tools because you need to test things out. You need to figure out if it works for you and your team or your culture. So a lot of those resources are free for download or very, very inexpensive.
Anybody else have? I got a lot of kudos here on the chat box. Thank you, guys. Shannon, thanks you.
Yeah, happy to answer any questions that you have. Feel free to send those private message too if you're not into the sharing mode or if it's a very specific question for your organization. I'm happy to answer.